Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to day 2 of Siggraph. I'm joined by amazing artist, instructor, founder of Rocket Lasso, and someone who I've learned pretty much everything I know from, Chris Schmidt. How's it going?
It's going very well. I'm excited to be here again as always. Thanks for coming and hanging out.
We're excited to have you. And yeah, I know you're going to be showing some stuff in Voronoi refracturing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some tips and tricks?
Yep.
Cool, let's get into it.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm going to be talking decently fast today because we got lots of files to cover. And what will we be talking about? Well, first of all, I'm Chris Schmidt. I am the founder of Rocket Lasso, where we go and we make live streams every week. I do a live stream talking about Cinema 4D, answering questions. Oop, that's a thing. Yeah, answering questions during the live stream from people in the audience live, figuring out Cinema 4D questions, recreating cool pieces of artwork. Also, we do tutorials. I have tutorials online, lots of stuff covering features of Cinema 4D, a lot of the new features. Whenever new versions of Cinema come out, I always try and tackle everything and explain to everybody the best that I can, the new stuff that's coming out. And of course, we make plugins where we have a bunch of different spline tools where you can convert polygons into splines and be slicing things, and we've got Ricochet, which is this amazing laser that bounces around, but we're not talking about any of that today. Today, we're going to be talking about 50 minutes of tips and tricks all about the Voronoi fracture. This tool's been out for a while, but I feel like it's probably the tool inside of Cinema 4D that has the most settings, and there's probably a bunch of parts of it that you've never touched or you've never gone too in-depth with. So I'm going to assume that the people watching know the basics of the Voronoi fracture, so we're not going to cover the super basics. But let's move on into talking about some of the more specific features that you might not have played with. Now, to begin with, the super duper basics, what is the Voronoi fracture doing on the most basic level? Well, you might be feeding it a piece of geometry like this plane object, and then there's going to be the sources. So if I select the Voronoi fracture, inside of the sources, you see that we have some sort of source, and that's represented by these points here. So activating the Voronoi fracture, you'll see that we suddenly get all these spaces, and every one of these dots is inside of that cell, but it's not in the center. You can see that even on this one, like clearly that's way off to the side. So why are those not centered on it? Well, what it's actually doing is it's finding the halfway point in between all of the adjacent points. So you can see that this one, there's a point here and a point here. So this line is actually the perfect halfway point between them. And then from here to here, we're at the perfect halfway point in between those. Wherever those lines intersect, that is what a Voronoi fracture is. So that's the super basics of the concept. Jumping on here, we've got a bunch of different break patterns. Now, you probably know all about the regular source where you take a object, feed it into the Voronoi fracture, and it's going to break it apart into a bunch of different pieces. We can go into the sources and do basic things like crank up the count of them and get a whole bunch of different pieces. Moving into something slightly fancier, you probably know the basics of this, but if we delete the sources, we could do something like feed the same geometry in, so we're feeding the object into itself. If I hit NB, we can see the different polygons, and you can see that the center point of every single one of those is now, it's finding the distance from this point to that point, and the halfway line ends up with a bunch of different hexagons. That's pretty neat, and a basic setup. You can click on any object you feed in, change the creation method. Here it's vertices. We can do the center of the edges, polygon centers, the surface of the object. But you can add a lot more power to this immediately by maybe making a duplicate of the object. So we've got two different objects. Now, if I go into the fracture, delete this sphere, and instead link this one, I've now decoupled those two, meaning I could, let's visually hide the second one. Let's subdivide this a lot more. You can see right now it's very low poly. We can see how these edges are super sharp. But I can keep the same pattern by decoupling them. Let's crank this up to 64 segments. Very smooth, but the same hexagon pattern. Selecting the original sphere, we can change the count of that independently now of the point count of the original object. So the ability of decoupling them is very powerful. But going beyond that, we can start doing even fancier things by using the new capsules, the modeling capsules that were introduced in 25 and 26. Moving into the asset browser, let's move into nodes, and we have this entire list of geometry modifiers. Now, I've been mentioning these often, but I think a lot of people still don't know about them. I'm going to switch to list mode and shrink it way down, and what you're going to see is a list of procedural, essentially these are deformers. We can procedurally modify geometry in really interesting ways. So let's hide the fracture for a moment and just look at this sphere. The super duper basic one we can do is let's do an inset. So search this list, grab the inset and drag it as a child, and you see it comes in as an object. Now this is actually using the new node system inside of Cinema, but you don't even have to think about it like that. You can just drag it in as if it's a deformer. So here's that inset. I can change the inset to be whatever proportion I want. It's kind of behaving like a bevel right now. But a simple procedural setup here, if I turn back on our fracture, you can now see that we've got a very different looking pattern on there. By selecting the inset, I could increase the amount of that, and you can see that I have now got a hex inside of a hex, but rotated 30 degrees. So that's kind of a cool pattern we can layer up on top of it. But then we can do something like poke polygons. Let me drag this one over, turn off the fracture for a moment. And what's poke polygons do? Well, the poke polygons essentially puts a point right in the middle of every polygon and connects them. So you can see if you look at this one triangle here, I can turn on poke polygons. It's now turned into 3 triangles. Now, that by itself, inside the Voronoi, is just going to double the number of hexes, although you can see that they're overlapping in a slightly more interesting way. But yeah, we've just doubled the number of hexes. But once you start combining that, perhaps with the inset, and rearranging the order, we can start getting some more randomized shapes from that. And then let's grab, say, the chamfer, add that in. And what I'm doing right now is just layering a series of different patterns on top of each other, where our piece of geometry here is subdividing in crazier and crazier ways. Let me make this really small. In fact, I'd love to make it proportional. Set that down to less than 1. And you can see that we can start making these crazy patterns just from this geometry, totally procedurally, but hiding that and going back into the fracture, we can now see how this is being referenced to create, kind of these, very repeating, almost stained glass window patterns. So always remember, you don't have to just feed the object into itself. You can modify it in all sorts of crazy, interesting ways, especially using these geometry modifier nodes. So that's some basics when it comes to the just feeding a sphere and feeding the object into itself. But let's move into the basics of using let me delete those. The basics of using the matrix object. So we create a plane here. The plane's got some subdivisions on it. We can get rid of those if we want. Drop that down to 1 by 1. And we can feed in a matrix object. Now, the basics, a lot of you probably already know. If we create a matrix object, then by default we get a grid of 40 by 40. We can now feed that matrix in as the source of the object. Visually, I'll hide the matrix, dragging the matrix in. You can now see that we have subdivided this into a grid. So that means anything we do with this with the matrix object, we are able to modify. As we modify the input, let's show the matrix again. I would like to create a bunch of this hexagon pattern, or this honeycomb pattern. Let's face it up on Y, and it's really big right now. T for scale, shrink it down, and now you can see we get a nice series of hexes layering up on top of each other. I always love playing with the hex pattern. Something about that is just inherently appealing. Increase the count until this is overlapping beyond. So okay, that's all working well. And you can make all sorts of modifications on your matrix, lines, linear. We'll talk about a couple different ones. But, here we're getting these perfect hexagons, but let's just modify those slightly. Selecting the matrix object, I'll feed in a random effector. Now, it's going to be super random. You see the matrix has moved all over the place, and so this starts looking like your vanilla source object. But let's make that a little more controlled. Drop this to 0, 0, 0, and let's just start slightly increasing this offset. Slightly increasing. So now you see we've kind of got these randomized hexes, a lot more, it's organic but controlled, but you can definitely feel the pattern. I really love doing those types of things. Keeping this, let's hide the matrix. So now that we've got this shape, let's play with it a little bit further. Let's, turn off the colorizing fragments. So now you just see the final geometry. I'd like to erase out a bunch of them, so let's feed in a plane effector directly into the fracture. What would I like to do with that plane effector? Well, let's scale everything down in a uniform, absolute way to -1. Everything gets erased because every one of the cells has shrunk down to nothing. Now let's limit what's being shown by creating a spherical field. So with a spherical field, I would like to get rid of the Falloff. So under remapping, I'll crank this up. T for scale, make it larger. Kind of get that perfect shape right there. And back inside the spherical field, select the remapping and say invert. So now I've just got this circle of them. So that's working just fine for me. Maybe we could put a little spacing in there by saying, okay, Voronoi fracture. Let's add in a bit of a gap. So we can say offset fragments, and you get that space in between. So then we could start procedurally modeling on top of this as well. So I'll throw this into a connect object. So let's say connect. Those have now all gotten turned into a single piece of geometry. If I make that connect editable, you'll see I get one model. If you were to just make the Voronoi fracture editable, you'll get a whole bunch of separate pieces of geometry. So that's what that connect is doing. But now I could go back into our procedural modeling and do something like maybe select, where's the extrude? Here it is, extrude. So let's extrude those. So those are all extruding, pull out the offset, and we can add a bunch of offset variation on there. Let's push this up, and instantly, I just really love these types of kind of crystalline structures. Very clean, very random. We have the completely procedural setup, and that's something that we're going to be seeing over and over again in this presentation, is we could modify any part of this, and the entire rig is still built, the entire rig is ready to be manipulated in any way that you want to. So I could scale this original shape, make them larger, make them smaller. We can add additional layers. Let's grab another chamfer like before, and let's again change that to be proportional. Limit it so they can't go beyond the original, they can't overshoot beyond where they'd overlap another polygon. And you can see where we get kind of a cool looking crystal structure there. Let's push this beyond. Let's see, and change this from points to edges. So now I want to cross the threshold, so only these very sharp 90-degree angles are going to be affected. So I can pull this back, and as I do, let's make this even smaller. You see that we can make some nice sharp pointed crystals. We could pull these back and just get that nice bevel just barely on the edge. Or, like I said, we can push this as far as we want here and just get a bunch of random spikes. So just using Voronoi fracture in a very intentional, controlled way, procedurally creating these setups, it's just a lot of fun to layer these things. Okay, moving on. Let's take a look at another couple of setups. Here, exact same setup. We've got a plane. Let's make a brand new matrix, something as simple as throwing this into a radial mode. And let's make, let's make 100 subdivisions. Oh, that's the radius. Let's make 100 count. So a whole bunch of dots going all the way around. In the fracture, we'll set the source to be this matrix object, and we'll get a nice spiral going all around, all these little spikes. But again, let's modify that just slightly and make a nice shatter pattern by feeding in a random, which is going to, again, be super crazy. Although you see the detail is focused in the center, which is kind of cool. But under random, let's zero these out for position, and just start slowly increasing on X. And you can see how we start randomizing these spikes. Just a little offset, just a little difference. And you get so much more control over that pattern. If I hit T for scale and push the matrix, scale the matrix up beyond it, you see that we just get these nice, clean, randomized spikes where you can imagine, adding dynamics on here and crashing a sphere through the center. But, continue on, let's just talk about a bunch of different patterns that we can feed through. So here, a setup that, a basic setup here as well, where we have a plane, the fracture is being fed a matrix. You see the matrix is just a dot, a dot, a dot. And of course, because they're all just in alignment, the cuts happen perfectly in between each of the matrix objects. So you can see that there's a line perfectly in between these two. So that's why we get these perfectly straight lines. Let's feed in another random. And this random will be affecting this matrix. Visually, I like making a child just so I associate those in my head. So again, let's zero those out. Very random, but you see the crack, the destruction here is definitely in the center area. Let's zero that out, zero that out, zero that out, and start adding on a little bit of, like even just like 2. Look at, we get this nice crack traveling right through the center. So that's looking great to me. Let's duplicate that matrix and let's make there be, right now it's a straight line of 222. But let's make there be 2 lines of that. Put a little spacing in there. Temporarily turn off its random. Let's feed that in as an additional source. When it comes to these sources, you can add in as many as you want. You could add in geometry. You could add in a bunch of different matrices. So let's do that here, adding a second matrix, and we get more cuts. Reactivating that random, we can add variation there. We can push both of these as far as we want. Let's keep on pushing this one further, adding more variation. But now you can see that these end up with big giant pieces. We get lots of detail here that aren't super large. So doing something right now, like adding in a bullet. When they added the new simulations in 26, the old simulation system, the rigid bodies and the soft bodies are now called bullet tags. So let's add a rigid body on there. And I've got this sphere, which is keyframe to travel from here over to there. So let's add on a bullet collider body. I believe if we go to our bullet simulation settings, oh yeah, let's turn off gravity so nothing falls away. And if I hit play, hopefully right now, we're going to see that crashes through and only that part is really being damaged. So back to the Voronoi fracture, let's hide the colorize NA, and now we can actually see the final geometry. And just with a couple matrices, we have very controlled destruction crashing through. So I really love being able to act, controlled randomness is like where it's at. That's why everybody loves the Cinema 4D noises so much, where it's like, okay, there's these patterns, but based on the randomness and the chaos of those patterns, we have so much artistic freedom within that. So let's move on to another cut pattern. So here's a car out of the asset browser. What I'd like to do with this one is, well, let's fracture it up. I want to grab just the glass, throw that into a fracture, and get rid of the current sources. And this time, let's create a nice, simple sphere. I want it to be pretty small. I'll set that down to 5. And, it's kind of out of the way right now. An easy way to place the sphere is using our placement tool. So if I select the placement tool over here, I can now just move this around. You see it snaps directly anywhere on the surface on any of this geometry. I think I actually want that to be a little smaller. Drop that down to 3. So I can move that around perfectly on the windshield. Let's make that a source. Well, first of all, let me change the pattern type. I'm going to change the sphere to be a icosahedron. And then in our fracture, let's say that becomes the source. It's going to be viewing the points of that source. And you can see that we get a nice looking shatter right in that particular position. So I could, using the placement tool, move that shatter anywhere that I like. But you can push it further. If we hold down control, you can make, actually what I'd like to do is feed this into a connect object. And instead of in the Voronoi fracture feeding in the sphere, I'll feed in this connect object. So the connect object is kind of breaking it down into one model as we did earlier. But now if I select the sphere and hold down control, I can actually make an instant duplicate of it. And now just make that a child of the connect. And that has been added in. So I've got a second shatter in that spot. And I didn't have to keep on going into the Voronoi fracture and relinking every single sphere. So now it's really easy to make another copy. And let's make another copy. And another copy. And just place all of these exactly where we want the shatter to be. Now all I have to do is select them, drop them as a child of the connect, and each of them is fed through instantly into the system. So yeah, really fun to do that. In addition, let's grab the original sphere, and all the other ones are instances, thanks to the placement tool. Holding that control creates an instance for us. Let's increase the radius up to, 15. That's probably a little large. Let's do 8. So larger sphere, you can see it changes the pattern a little bit. We get nice kind of randomized breaks here. But we can change the fracture input. If we select it, right now it's looking at the individual points there. And of course, you have control of increasing the points here. So as I make more, we'll get more fracturing. Make less, there'll be fewer. But let's change this instead to not view the vertices, but let's view the volume of it. So the internal volume of each of those spheres. And it's currently trying to create 20 points total, which is not very many. But let's jump it up to, say, about 200. And now we get a more randomized pattern. Let's add another on there and make it about 2,000. We start getting all these little dots. And we get tons of random cracks on the windshield that we're easily able to art direct and easily place around. Moving on to the next file. Okay, this one, let's make sure that, well, hopefully this will work. Everything we've been doing right now had a lot of randomness. But what if you want to be very specific on where you place things? Well, a cool way to do that inside of Vanilla Cinema is adding a hair object. So I've got this cube and it's going to be fractured, but there's no source. So let's add on a simulation hair object, add hair. So now it's created a couple of hair guides on these different points. Let's change some settings right away. I want this to be very few points. So I'll say, hey, guides, you're only one, actually not a count of one, but let's make the segments only one. So there's only one point going across. Let's tell the hair that the hair shouldn't be interpolating between the guides. I'm going to say, actually, the hair, you're exactly whatever the guides are doing. So we'll say as guides. So right now there's only 4 hairs. And then under generate, let's say don't render hairs. Instead, return those as actual geometry. I'm going to say I want it to be a spline. So if I make this hair editable, then you're going to see it's a spline object and is only made up of these 8 individual segments. So hitting undo, if we move into, well, now in the fracture, let's drag in the hair as our source. There's a bunch of different ways of interpreting it. So selecting it, we can change the distribution type. What I found works well is I'll just set that to step. And now it's seeing every one of those hairs. So where things can get interesting is, well, let's go to simulate. Hair selection, I'll say, we have to go to model. Simulation, hair selection, and I'll say, why is that? Oh, I have to select the hair object. That'll help. Hair selection, and I'll say select all, hit delete, and now, no hairs whatsoever. Going into simulate, hair tools, add guides. So these are the default settings, but what I should be able to do is start painting on the object, and anywhere that I'm growing a hair, we're now using the hair tool to paint different fracture inputs anywhere that we want. So we can say, okay, it's just going to crack right along this edge. Maybe we come over to this corner. It's like, oh, this corner should be really, really damaged. So I can just keep on painting. Now, by default, you'll see that there's a lot of subdivisions on here, and that's because we have a large radius. So I can shrink that way down, and it's trying to create 10 hairs at the same time. So I'll say, oh, only create one. So now I could start painting a way more controlled thing. You see, I can get this very nice controlled pattern as I move it along. Something that you should keep in mind that's a little bit unintuitive is, of course, the breaks happen at the halfway point in between these. So if I wanted a nice clean line, say, traveling along that, the string of hairs I just made, I'd actually want to draw two different lines and make sure that that's at the halfway point. But just kind of artistically speaking, being able to place these exactly where you want to adds just so much power into it. And after you do that quick little setup, then you are ready to go. We could, again, paint a very small area, get lots of detail, put a couple of extra random runs right where we want the breaks. Lots of control, very fun. I think there's actually a plugin on Cineversity that does a similar thing without having to use hair, but I was trying to do the vanilla version of it. Let's move into the next file. And what is this one? Okay, this is all about refracturing something. So I want to talk about a little technique I've been doing a lot that if people aren't familiar with, you should totally start doing, because with ZBrush becoming part of the Maxon family, the first thing that they did is they ported over the remeshing algorithm from ZBrush into Cinema, and it's so powerful and it's so intuitive to use. So let's go and do that. What I want to do is turn this figure into a single mesh that's very controllable, but it's still pretty low poly. Like, have all the detail, but be low poly. So what we would have done in the past is feed this into a volume builder, and that gets fed into a volume mesher, but you're going to see that's very low resolution. We're losing almost everything. So then you would want to decrease your voxel size, so we go smaller. It's like, okay, we can kind of see it, but let's go even smaller. It's like, okay, well, the character's starting to come through, but it looks a little skinny. So we can use the dilate and erode. Essentially, we can inflate it. And I only want to inflate a little bit. But here you can see that it's like, okay, well, it's working well, but like the leg, those are blobbing into each other right now. So that means we have to increase the resolution even more. And then if you want to be running like a simulation or something, you see we've got like a really high poly count now. Like it's blobbed together well, but that poly count's just, not usable as far as a simulation would be concerned or something like that. But now we can take this and very easily throw it into a remesh. And all I'm going to do is say, hey, return 25% of the points. And now you can see that that's brought it back down again very quickly, very cleanly. We can even turn on Symmetry X, and now you can see it will mirror, and it looks perfect left and right. So that's just a little bonus about a technique of turning something into a nice clean blob and a mesh that you can start to use. Now that we've got that, let's drop it as a child of this fracture. And, basic setup, it's got the default point generation, and it's breaking apart into 20 different segments. And there's a little bit of a gap. We got this gap of 1. Let's even change the gap to 2. What if we want to fracture this again? Well, let's just create a brand new fracture, and I'll feed this directly into it. And it's not going to look any different because this is being fed the exact same sources again. They both have the same random seed, so essentially it did nothing. If we click on this brand new second fracture that we made, though, and go into sources and select the point generator, there's a setting here that you might not have ever used called Create Points Per Object. And we know that we're feeding in 20 different objects. So if I turn that on, now every one of those individual segments has broken apart into 20 different segments. And we can change that to any count that we want. Change the random seed. We can put a little bit of offset fragments here, so I can shrink those down. So now we get a gap of 2 and a gap of 1, and we can fracture again and be smaller and smaller and smaller as we keep on creating additional segments. But let's get rid of that offset fragment and show you something that's even better. If we go back to this original fracture, in fact, let's turn off the second one. So we're just looking at this one. You see that we've got all these different points on it. What I would like to do, because this is a mograph object, we can right-click on it, go to the mograph tags, and add on a mograph weight map. This is very much like the vertex weight map, where what it's doing is assigning a 0 to 100% value to every one of these individual cells, every single one of these clones. So if we say use fields on the tag, I can say I want this to be random. I'll add a random field in there, set it to just a pure random. And you should be able to see, if I select just the tag, that we've got all these dots, and we've got everything from yellow, which is 100%, and red, which is 0, and every orange in between. Now, if we go into the second Voronoi fracture, I can say we've got, in the main tab, this mograph weight map. If I drag this random weight map that we just created into here, now what it's going to do is re-weight how many cuts each of these segments is going to get. So you can see here that this one has quite a few, but where's one with low? Like right here, it looks like we only got 3 cuts. Let's make this a little bit more extreme by going into the weight map. And I really love, under the modifier layers, this nice simple curve where we can increase the contrast very easily. I'm going to increase this and increase the chances of a low number. And let's also increase the chances of a high number. And you can see that this one doesn't even look like it got cut at all. And this one got cut a whole bunch. Back into the random field, we keep on randomizing the seed, and it's going to apply the weight differently, which means different cuts happen in different places. And this is a multiplier on how many different cuts that there are. Inside of the second fracture, back to the sources, we can say, right now there's only 20 pieces, but let's jump that up to about 50, and that will cut even more. And it's just going to multiply that original value over and over again, so that, we have perfect control over what gets refractured via that weight map. So if you've ever wondered what this mograph weight map did, this is what it does. And that ties in, you have to have this create points per object turned on, otherwise that won't do anything. Okay, moving on. What do we got this one? Yeah, I'm going to skip over this one because we've got a lot to cover. Okay, another type of source that you might not have ever used is actually the shader type. I'm going to delete that for a moment, and we can create, empty sources, nothing's going on. We can add a shader source onto there. And what does this do? Well, it's going to reference a shader. We can, like a lot of tools in Cinema, we can feed a shader directly in, or it could reference a material you dragged on. But it works really well with the different noises inside of Cinema. So in this case, how about we create a noise? Inside of the noise, I would like something with a lot of contrast. And one noise that this might be neat if you've never played with it. We can go into something like the Voronoi 1, feeding a Voronoi 1 noise into a Voronoi fracture. So you see we get all, a very nice cell-looking pattern. But if we change the contrast here a bit, you can actually make a series of perfect little circles. So that's kind of the basis of this. So it's a cool way of creating spots, and you can always take this and add multiple shaders and start layering them up on top of each other. I'd like to make this way larger, so let's jump it up to about 500. And so we've got all these individual spots, and you can start seeing that we're getting clustering of this source. Back into the fracture, let's crank up our count. So how many do we want? Well, I'm going to say like about 500. And, there's going to be more points. And you definitely see that we get sort of a grid pattern going. You can hide that grid pattern by increasing your sample precision. It does slow it down. But by increasing the sample precision, you can now see that it's more clearly referencing those different circular blobs. So now it's a fun way of creating these different clusters. So we'll be touching upon that again. But if you haven't played with the shader input, then the shader source, then it's definitely worth checking out. Okay. New category of things. Let's start talking about the geometry glue, which is actually pretty awesome. So to begin with, here is a disk shape. Let's feed that into a fracture. And we're just creating a whole bunch of different subdivisions. Let's create way more subdivisions. Let's jump this up to about 500 again. And I'm going to hit NA, so we're just seeing the final output. Let's move into our geometry glue tab. If we turn this on, we've got a couple of different settings. Default is Falloff, but let's start out with cluster. It's the most straightforward to understand. You know that we've got 555 pieces on this fracture right now, but if I turn on the cluster, it's going to say a cluster amount of 5, meaning it is going to start combining as many pieces as it has to until we only end up with 5. But now what we end up with is something that's way more detailed along the edges. So let's increase this up to something like, say, 55. And now we've got these really interesting looking chunks breaking up the surface instead of, those perfect, like, convex shapes. So yeah, simple cluster. If you haven't played with it, it's a great way of adding extra detail onto the object. Now, we could play around with this a little bit more if you want to, make things even more detailed. For instance, I could feed this fracture into, let's feed it into a, how do I want to do this? Let's put it into a null. So I'm going to hit Alt-G to group it. Let's move into our geometry modifier nodes again. And a really cool node that we have access to is, where is it? Melt. We can grab melt, put that next to the null, and now all of those individual sections remove all their subdivisions, and we've just got that perfect outline of a shape. Taking that entire piece, I could feed it into a connect. So that is now welding all those different pieces together. Then, now that it's all connected, let's grab maybe a smooth. So inside our deformers, find smoothing, drop that in, and this is going to make a really weird shape, but if I turn that on, we can start increasing our iterations. Let's go down to 0. As it starts smoothing, you're going to see we get, because they're n-gons, we get these really funky shapes. But look at this just crazy parametric pattern. Like, how would you generate this on a piece of geometry? Like, I just have no idea how I might approach that. So, yep, just throwing out weird things that maybe somebody's going to find interesting and, can make something cool out of. That's what I do. If you want something that looks really pretty, you got to go to somebody else. But if you want cool, weird, technical things, that's when you come check out Rocket Lasso. Okay, so moving on. This one we are going to be, right here we're just fracturing a cube stretched out. Let's talk about the next type of geometry glue, and that is using the, let's see, which one am I going to use? Let's use the cluster. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We're going to use the Falloff type. So I actually haven't used the Falloff object very much. If we turn on geometry glue, activate it, we have now a Falloff, and you can click add geometry, add glue Falloff. That's going to create a Falloff object for us. And by default, it's kind of empty. But the Falloff has become a lot more powerful because now fields are inside there. So essentially, this is just like, I'm just holding a field to pass the information on. So doing something real simple, if we make a linear field, I can tell that to, where's the linear field? Tell that to aim on Y. So now we got this big Falloff going. And you see that everything above the 50% mark has gotten merged into one piece. If we go back into our fracture, I can say glue the rest of it. So any remainders will get glued together. If I turn that on, we're now left with exactly 2 pieces. Now, something that's kind of cool here, because we're down to 2 pieces, I can feed in a simple step effector. Step effector. And I don't want to affect the scale. I'd like to affect the position. So let's just offset that a bit. And now you can see that we get this really cool crack traveling through that center point where all those pieces have gotten merged. But these are like perfect clean volumes. If we travel inside, you see it's going to be completely empty except for that piece. So a really controllable way of getting, in this case, just exactly 2 pieces. If we grab the linear field, hit R for rotate, we could spin it a little bit. We can place this wherever that we want. And because that's a big, giant linear Falloff, we could manipulate, we can make it more advanced on where it's getting applied. So inside of the Falloff, we now know that there's a big Falloff from 0 to 100%. Inside the field, I could create a random field, which is a big, giant cloud of noise. And I'm going to say, let's overlay that. So just like Photoshop, we've got a perfect gradient, and now I'm overlaying a noise on top of it. And if we select the random field, I think we got to make it way larger. As we start increasing it, we should start seeing a little more uniformity. And now you can see that we've got a little bit more interesting of a cut traveling up and down. So yeah, increasing that scale, we can change the noise type. It's Perlin right now. We make something super crazy like a Luca and keep on cranking that scale up, clicking the random seed, find a pattern that we like the look of. I think I want to go even larger. Yeah. So now, yeah, nice large one. And as I keep on clicking this random seed, you're going to see different breaks in different spots. Grabbing that step, I could increase the spacing between them and just get like really cool looking breaks in between those shapes. So that is using some Falloffs as our geometry glue source. Closing that, it's already built here, but here's the exact same idea applied. Oop, looks like it didn't want to apply correctly. There we go. So here's the exact same thing, but you can put it on a more complex piece of geometry, like this text right here. So using that exact same Falloff trick, this time instead of offsetting with a step, I'm offsetting with a plane. So I could tell this to separate out even more, pull them down, so you can have all these connected. What's even more fun, I could increase that gap, and now inside of just the plane, which is grabbing these chunks that are on the upper half, I can say, okay, let's add an additional Falloff. So let's say another linear field. This one will multiply on top of it. let's make it, well, even that's fine. If I grab this field and go to object mode and move it across, we can actually have each of these individually crack as we go through. And, you know, as your linear field is larger, you could space those out more. Oop, looks like I pushed that too far. But yeah, that's the idea, is like take these simple techniques and start applying them to more advanced models and projects, and you get some really cool, very quick results. Okay, what do we got? We're going to skip this one. Clustering, this one, super straightforward. I've got that, I was showing you the shader source with the Voronoi one with all the little spots. This is the exact same setup on this big complex object. So just to round out the geometry glue, if we go into that geometry glue and say, let's use distance this time, the point distance, if we turn that on, even, I think that's the default value. No, default value is 0. But if we set that to like 15, each of these clusters is getting merged down into one, and we end up with, let's turn on this push apart effector. Each of these is a way more interesting looking chunk because there's way more detail inside of it because all those points got merged into one piece. So just another way of using the geometry glue. Jumping on into the next one. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the detailing tab inside of the Voronoi fracture. Okay, basic fracture, seen this a bunch of times. I'm going to turn on this plane effector, which is scaling everything down to 0. So as I pass this through this geometry, you can see I'm just erasing out some of the chunks. Okay, so that's looking fine. But now, very simply, we can move into the Voronoi fracture. And if you haven't played with this, you definitely should. And that is, where is it? Detailing. So detailing, super simple. We can just activate detailing. Now, there's a lot of settings in here, but you're going to see right away that all the internals, let me turn it off and then turn it on, and you see all this extra detail up here. Hitting, we'll turn it off, hit NB, and we can see our polygons very clean and simple on the inside. Activate the detailing, of course, everything gets very subdivided. The key setting here being the maximize edge length, and that's sort of your resolution. If I cut it to half the size, we're going to get way more polygons and way more detail. So that looks cool right out of the gate. You can detail things, of course. A couple settings that I hadn't played with that are actually pretty cool, and that is, one of them is our use original edges. You'll see on this object, like all these edges are very straight, like they're where the natural cuts of the Voronoi source would have been. If I turn off use original edges, then those, or is it that one? Or is it noise surface? Oh, that, okay, sorry. Noise, if you activate noise surface, you'll see that the noise will actually apply to those edges as well. So, just a checkbox. I was like, oh, I'd never turned that on. That actually works really, really well. In addition to that, I'll turn it off. In addition, you've also got keep original surface. If I turn that off, it'll actually mess up the outer part as well. We'll be talking about that more in a moment. Turn that back off again, though. And here's another cool looking one, and that is the relax inside edges. Essentially, it's like smoothing, but it's applying not to the outer shell, but everything on the inside with a fall off. So if I start adding in, let's turn off the colored pieces here. So if you can see how, where'd it go? Detailing. If we have 0 relaxing, you see everything kind of just blends into each other. But as we start increasing these relaxed inside edges, you can see that these start separating out. And you actually get like a whole bunch of detail on these interiors. So like, if you were running dynamics on this, you could like really feel these individual pieces and where they're breaking apart. So I really love the separation that we get by adding in these relax inside edges. And again, we've got this plane effector. I could pull this in and out, and you see the outside looks great. And as we move in, we got all these details that don't blend into each other in a great way. Closing that. Okay, so this is just a fun little project for a way of using the detailing in maybe an unintuitive way. So here's just a basic primitive shape. Let's feed that into a fracture. And I would like to we're not going to subdivide at all. We have no point source on this one. Instead, let's move into our detailing, activate that, and let's start adding in some different, what do we got going on here? Oh yeah, well, we have to tell it to not keep the original surface, so the entire thing starts getting messed up. There's no pieces, and now we see it on the outside. So we can use any noise that we want, but I could start increasing our noise strength, and we start making like a really kind of crazy looking rock or boulder. We could, of course, do things like increase the scale of the noise. We could use different noise types, but I think it looks pretty cool when we just start like overshooting this. Let's find that right kind of blend where we get a cool looking shape. Yeah. So we get a cool looking shape, but it's kind of going too far where it's like, oh, that make a cool rock, but our geometry looks terrible. Like we couldn't actually work from this, and we wouldn't want to render it because all the fongs wouldn't be working and there'd be polygons intersecting and everything. But now with a bunch of those cool new tools that we have, we might be able to do something simple like throw this into a volume builder, throw that into a mesher, add as much detail as you need. Don't go overboard because the higher the voxel size, the quicker this will run. So you can probably leave it at 10. So now all those shapes that were running through each other just get blended into one piece, and then feeding that entire shape into the, let's feed that into the remesh, and we could even change the point count if we want to. We can now see that we get this nice smooth rock, decrease the poly count maybe to 50%, and yeah, very nice and clean. We make it crazy low poly, and just to show you, we could make infinite, this is just a random example, but we can make infinite variations on this. A fun way that I like doing is feeding this maybe into a cloner. So now this is going to create, in this case, 9 copies of it. If we make a duplicate of our remesh, I can say, hey, cloner, I would like you to not iterate between these 2 different rigs, but instead blend between them. And that means I can go into any setting here, and the cloner is smart enough where it will look at those parameters and blend from one to the next. So by moving into, let's say, this Voronoi fracture, I can say, the noise seed is going to be like a totally different number. So now every single one of these different rocks has been given a different seed, and now we've got infinite variation. I can make as many of those as I want. Change the number. You can imagine so many different ways of changing this. We could put in some deformers on the original piece of geometry, and each one could could be flatter or taller, and maybe we could actually turn on the fracturing and have some of these be broken apart into different pieces. There's so much potential for using this fracture in a very unconventional way. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there. Let's move on, and we've got a collection of continued random projects. As I mentioned, I do a live stream on Wednesdays where I just answer questions from people, and over the years, we've done so many different projects that involve the Voronoi fracture. So this is sort of a collection that we're going to kind of quickly go through, just weird, fun things you can do with it, things that you might not have normally thought about. So, got some text. Let's fracture it up. We've already talked about that. I'm going to connect it so it becomes a single model, and then we can turn on this remesh, and that remesh is just going to make nice, clean geometry. And then I'll delete that and do it from scratch, there is the new simulation system that was added in 26. Right-clicking, I could say, okay, let's add a cloth tag onto there. So this is a new cloth, and let's see, did I turn off gravity? Yes, I've turned off gravity. That's one thing I did. So now we've got the shape. What would I like it to do? Well, let's have it be very bendy. So I'm going to crank that up, and let's have it be very stretchy. And I think if we just hit play right now, then we should be able to get, well, so right now you see that it's like a simulated object that's just kind of sitting there. But there's a really cool setting called balloon. And if we activate balloon, it's going to try and inflate anything that's a volume. So what I'd like to do is increase the volume up to, let's say, 10, but I want it to take a long time to do it. So we'll crank this up a bit and say that this will take 100 frames to do. So you see this very quick procedural setup, add the simulation tag, hit play, and now we can have each of these segments inflate out, and they're just going to drift away. So as simple as that, I was able to create this animation with 0 keyframes. Now if you were, the likely thing that you'd want to be doing would be maybe building the text out of this. So right now, an easy thing you do is bake this out as a lembic and then just reverse the animation. The entire thing would be shrinking in and then forming that final letter. So just a little project there. Moving on. I don't think we have time for this one. This is a 3D model of a duck. How quickly? Well, let's see if it works. We were already talking about using hair to paint onto a model. Let's see if it actually... No, I don't think it's... Yeah, I messed something up on the file. And it does take a while to do. Yeah, we'll skip that one because I got way more that there's no way we're going to finish. What's this one? Oh, this one's really fun. So this was another question during the live stream. So super basic setup. We've got the text. Here's the default Voronoi fracture. Let's crank up the input here. And let's say, what do we want? Let's say 200? No, let's go even further. Let's do 2,000. So about 2,000 subdivisions on this. Lots and lots of different chunks being created. So now, something we've already kind of done before, let's create a plane effector. So it's going to push everything up. But let's say, nope, don't push everything up. Instead, scale everything in a uniform, absolute way to -1. So now we're just shrinking everything down to nothing. They disappear. So now let's limit where those are. Inside the field, let's drag the connect object, or essentially the text inside, as a point object. So now it's looking at the individual points there and creating fall off. Doesn't really look like too much right there. But if I select this connect and say, actually, I'd like you to look at the surface, it's now a fall off from the surface of the text moving inward. But what I'd love to do is crank up the contrast here so that it's either there or it's not. An easy way to do that is inside of your modifier layers, inside this field, I could say I would like a quantize and drop that down to 1 step, which essentially just means on or off. And now you can see that we've got only the interior of that. So you get this really cool broken apart object. If we move into the plane effector, I could say we can grab our radius and I can start increasing or decreasing that. So you can see how I'm erasing from the outside in until we get just these really cool looking chunks on the inside. Of course, it's going to be resolution dependent. So if you add more subdivisions, let's like jump this up to more than 5,000 subdivisions, we get more detail. They're nice and tiny. Let's get rid of our colorized fragments so they look a little more uniform. I don't know. It's just such a cool look, and there's so many ways you could use this. And again, procedural setup, we can just type in whatever we want here. Let's type in Siggraph, and the entire rig will just propagate up through and is ready to use on anything that you want. So really cool look there. And keep in mind, you always run like simulations and stuff on top of that as well. Closing that. Let's see how many of these we can get to. Okay. I don't know how practical this one is, but let's talk a little bit about adding simulations on here. So here's just a head. It's fractured, and I added on a simple simulation tag. If I hit play, the entire thing's going to fall away. It breaks apart. So you've probably played around with going into the fracture and saying, go to connectors and say, hey, create a fixed connector. So that creates a connector, and now the object is kind of stuck together. If we hit play with the dynamics, now you see it's wanting to hold together, and it'll only break when like a bunch of force was applied. So that's pretty cool. You've probably done that before. But did you know that you could change this connector to some different type? Let's change that from a fixed connector to a slider type. So now these pieces can only move along the x-axis of the overall object. So now when I click and let these drop, as it bounces, you're going to see that the head is constrained on that axis, and everything just stretches out in that direction. What would you use this for? I have no idea, but you can do it. Let's go back, and here's something that's even crazier. So that's adding in a connector. Let's delete that, and instead go into simulation, bullets, and create a spring. Let's drop that inside the connector, and the spring and the connector, I think they might actually be the same object code-wise. And what happens is you got object A, object B, and the fracture is automatically connecting all the neighbors. So now we've got a spring that's interconnecting all of these. If I turn on display, you're actually going to see all these connections being made on the model. So you can start, let's start out maybe a little bit practical and say that our rest length is 22. So essentially it's pulling everything tight. But keep in mind, these are springs. So let's turn off that display. If I hit play, you'll see that these will kind of bounce around, but they're springing together instead of just being glued together. You could make it even crazier still by increasing the rest length. Let's put that back up to say 100, and now these are attempting to stay 100 units apart. We could change the stiffness so they're like really trying to maintain this distance from each other. You could animate that like pushing out or pushing in. So you can definitely do some weird, crazy things by feeding in springs and trying some different some of the different connector types. What do we got here? Okay, very quick one. Here is a sphere. I've got some turbulence going. We're using the new cloth simulation. If I play, you're going to get this blob just kind of drifting around. Okay. Yeah, I think we're doing pretty well. So you can see this is drifting around. Let's activate the Voronoi fracture. And I've also got this matrix object. And I'm using 2 different randoms to have those different pieces drift around. So if I play, you're going to get this blob drifting around inside a cloud of matrix objects. So you got all these nice random cuts going around. But just to push it a little bit further, let's move into that geometry nodes, and what I'd like to do is delete the outer shell procedurally. So let's select the fracture object, and I'll say expose a selection. I want to see the outside faces, and then let's grab our delete. So if I drag this delete in, it's going to delete everything. But let's say that I don't want to delete default, which is all. I want to delete this selection. So as I drag that in, you see it automatically updates the text. So it puts in quotes the name of the selection tag, and now all of those outer pieces have gotten, all the outer shell of it's gotten removed. So if we increase our count a bit, you see we get all these nice subdivisions, and we get this really kind of crazy looking blob. Let's put less space in there. I think it looks a little bit better. Just space of 1. So I don't know. It's just a really cool look where we got this blob traveling through a cloud of noise where we only see the interior geometry. So we are virtually out of time, unfortunately. I've got a whole bunch more stuff, like we got these cool cracking effects. Let's close that. I think I actually have the final file here, yeah, so we can skip to that. By using the mograph weight tag, which we already talked about earlier, we can use the growth from the freeze, and we can increase the radius of that, letting it grow, and then translate that into a, what do you call it, the mograph selection tag, which you can then use inside of the dynamics to limit where they're going to get applied. So now by hitting play, I can get these individual pieces falling away in sequence. I've actually got a really detailed tutorial on here. It's actually the first tutorial I made on Rocket Lasso. So you can check that out on YouTube. I'm going to just have to do a follow-up online where we talk about a whole bunch more of these, because there's so many different fun things that I would love to talk about. We just don't have time. So let's move into this very final one, because I think it's kind of neat. So this will be the last one we do. What do I have here? Well, I've got a dynamic sphere, and if I hit play, and this is using the bullet simulation, it's just a sphere that drops down. So what I'm going to do is make a duplicate of that sphere and scale it up a little bit and throw that into a fracture. And then, what do I got? I've got this linear field on the ground. So I'm going to say, hey, this fracture, I would like there to be a mograph. Let's just go right to a mograph selection. And in that tag, I'm going to say, use the field. What are you referencing? Well, it's going to reference this linear field. So it's saying anything that goes below this pink linear field will get activated. So having to skip ahead, I'll jump straight to making a decay. Crank that up all the way. So now, once it passes through that linear field, it's going to remember that it went through it. So then, let's see, hitting play, I should be able to visualize this. Hitting play, this fracture is going to follow it, and you'll see that all those are getting selected as they go. So now, if we add on, from scratch, I can add on a simulation, a bullet, rigid body, and now we can limit to the mograph selection where you see those were getting activated, and the fracture is breaking apart into a bunch of different chunks. So it's moving anywhere this top sphere goes, but they get activated as a dynamic object when they pass beyond this linear, and they remember that they pass beyond it. So if I hit play, this, let's make sure that we've got this, well, file revert saved. Yeah, let's activate enabled, add in, oh dear. Yeah, so this is all set up there. I hit play, and now as that falls through, we get these different pieces that will pass through the linear field and get left behind as it rolls around fully dynamically. And you could apply this rig to anything you want. We can increase the shell size. It could be slowly growing as well. So yeah, lots of different details on that. So I'll definitely have a follow-up online with a bunch more stuff here, but hopefully you learned some things about the Voronoi fracture that you didn't know. Thank you, everybody, for coming and watching my presentation. A big thanks to Maxon for having me out. One last little detail. We are going to be having the Half-Res event in Chicago pretty much 1 month from now, September 9th. It's a one-night mini conference. So yeah, we're going to have a really great lineup of speakers. We got games and prizes. So it's just a really good time for motion artists in Chicago. So if you have an opportunity, you should come and hang out. And finally, you can follow Rocket Lasso at Rocket Lasso on all the different platforms. So yeah, that's where you can find me on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. So yep, thanks again.
Wow. Every new scene, I was like mind blown, and so was everyone on the chat, the questions area, and just saying this is wild, just how incredible this was. And there was a quick question actually from, oh, I can't read that name, but is there a way to create secondary destruction on collision? So it was as you were showing the sphere,
there was actually
coming down and breaking.
Yeah, there was a project that we had to skip where, essentially, you say secondary destruction. That would be. Let's hold that. That would be an excellent question for somebody to ask me during my live stream, because that's like a 30-minute question, not like a 2-minute question. But we could totally tackle that and try and figure it out during a live stream.
That sounds great. Yeah, so many great comments. Yeah, mine's well and truly blown. Any questions from anyone here? Raise your hand if you have. But yeah, if not, yeah, give it up for Chris.